I'm going to ask you to tell me, on these two things, what's same and what's different. So first I want you to tell me, what's different? What's different?
Color.
Color is different. Good boy, you're right. Okay.
Alex the parrot is one of a long line of students trying to help scientists understand the animal mind. He's been talking for 18 years, and he seems pretty clever. But does he know what he's saying?
Yeah, that was good. Color is different. Now I want you to tell me, when you finish that nut, I want you to tell me what's same.
Shape.
Shape is right. Good boy.
Science faces huge problems when it tries to explain what Alex's skills might mean.
Yeah, good boy.
Cork.
Oh, you want cork. I thought you'd want a cork. I thought you'd want a cork. No?
Go back.
You want to go back to Kelly? Okay, you can take a little
Alex
break.
speaks like a human, but does he think like one? What is it like to be a non-human animal?
Tickle. Tickle.
Let me give you an example of why it might be important. There's a great debate, of course, about animal welfare. Do chickens suffer when you keep them in battery cages? Do sheep suffer when you're transporting them in lorries? Now, a lot of the argument there is based on an anthropomorphic view of the behavior of animals. People say to themselves, well, I wouldn't like to be cooped up in a lorry at 95 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 hours being transported over to France. But if you really want to ask the question, does the sheep mind or does the chicken mind, we've got to understand how animals perceive the world, what level of self-awareness, what level of consciousness they have.
Consciousness, self-awareness, insight into one's own thoughts and feelings. It's the most elusive and intriguing problem in science. Do non-humans have it? Or are they more like soft automata, unconscious robots? Early scientific dreams of reducing all behavior to stimulus and response now seem naively optimistic. And in any case, animal thoughts and feelings were simply left out. Equinox visited 10 specialists in zoology, psychology and philosophy to hear about the extreme difficulty of penetrating the darkness of the animal mind. It seems that clues are to be found in unlikely places by scientists asking unusual questions.
I was curious to know whether vampire bats were capable of regurgitating blood or sharing food with individuals that might not be related to them. The work spanned a 5-year period, and we spent over 500 hours taking notes on what the bats were doing. Trees were very big. You could lie down inside the trees, and so they were home to lots of other animals, giant cockroaches, snakes, porcupines. Occasionally a basilisk lizard would come into the trees. Vampire bat roosts are easy to find because they only eat blood. Blood is primarily protein, so when the bats defecate, it has a very strong ammonia smell. So you can smell a vampire roost at several yards before you enter the tree. We had to wear respirators, masks, to protect ourselves against fungus that grows in bat guano in some of these sites. And that actually helped, prevented the smell from being overwhelming. But they're fascinating animals. It actually was quite fun. The bats have heat sensors in their nose to locate places on the animal's skin where the blood vessels are close to the surface. So when they make a bite, by using their incisors, which are sort of like taking a golf swing and taking a divot out of the earth, they take a divot of flesh out of the animal's skin, and the anticoagulant in their saliva causes the blood to flow continuously. They lick the blood just like a cat licks milk from a bowl. But finding a cooperative animal is clearly not that easy. By netting animals returning to their roost sites, we were able to discover that young animals less than 2 years of age don't feed successfully about 20% of the time. They come back after spending the night looking for food, and they come back essentially empty. And those are the bats which beg from other individuals in the group and are almost always fed. One bat gave away blood. Subsequently, when it was starved, it was more often than not fed by the bat that it had fed. And they reciprocated these sharing events. That, to me, is the really unique part of this story.
So it does seem that vampire bats have friends and know how to recognize their friends.
If by friends you mean you're willing to give away something which is food in your stomach. I mean, that certainly seems to be true.
Wilkinson's study is scientifically important because it showed that altruistic food sharing occurs in unrelated mammals. In the search for animal awareness, it's suggestive. But does it tell us if the bats are aware of what they're doing?
Designing an experiment to have an animal tell you what it's thinking is difficult because you can't talk to the animal. And you run the risk of introducing your own perceptions into what that animal is doing. What can they do? We really haven't really scratched the surface for most species.
It's very difficult to imagine whether an animal knows that it's alive and where it is. I'd like to know if they know that themselves. I'd like to know if my dog knows their dogs. I think that's the thing that I would like to know best. Well, you see by looking at me that I'm a pet lover, and I think all pet lovers up to a point have a bit of an anthropomorphic view about animals and sort of associate them with themselves. But I have really, I'm trained also as a scientist, and I have no views. I have absolutely positive that animals do have emotions and that I can relate with animals and that they're not robots. Consciousness is something quite different. I think you could have emotions without being conscious. And I think that with human beings, too, there's different levels of consciousness. And I think that quite a lot of the time you're not conscious at all. And it's been revealed, hasn't it, by Freud, that there's a great deal that happens to you, that influence you, that is important to you, which you're totally subconscious. You don't know anything about it. And I'm sure that it will be the same with dogs.
Experiments in the United States have shown that few animals learn to recognize themselves in a mirror, but the chimpanzees and orangutans do seem to understand their own reflections. Surely this is strong evidence that great apes, at least, know who they are and share our kind of self-awareness.
It's interesting that chimpanzees can find out about the state of their body by looking in a mirror. But does that really imply that the chimpanzees know something about themselves in the way in which we normally think about the human self? It doesn't, as far as I can see, imply, for example, that the chimpanzees know about their own mortality, know that they began at a certain time and inevitably they will die. That's an important part, I think, of a human self-concept, to recognize that we're mortal. But the capacity to use a mirror implies you know something about your body, but not that you know something about mortality. The problem is that as most of us understand self-awareness, we only have one case to go on, our own. We know for sure, I know for sure, that I am conscious. Now, when you have that sort of view of what consciousness is, as something intrinsically private, then really it's the case that you can't know for sure whether any other creature is conscious. So the possibility arises that they're not, that they are all little robots, behaving cleverly, but there is no internal light on, as it were. If a creature is not conscious, as we normally understand consciousness, as a private thing, then it's something like a sleepwalker, or as we conventionally understand an automaton or a robot to be. And it's conceivable, it seems to me, that animals are like that. That doesn't mean we should assume that they are.
If you look at the Song of a Nightingale, it's enormously complex. In fact, I totted it up and it has more notes in it than Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. A nightingale only has to hear the tutor song once and it can reproduce it, note perfect. Well, one good example of remembering things is animals that have the habit of storing food, like squirrels or certain members of the crow family or titmice. Imagine you hid 10,000 bunches of keys in your house in October and you wanted to go back and find them the following May or June. How good would you be at doing that? Would you be able to find all of them? Well, some of these birds, and probably squirrels as well, have a memory that allows them to solve that kind of task. You shouldn't assume that just because an animal has a good memory that it's aware of what it's doing or that it has any form of consciousness. After all, your laptop computer can store huge amounts of information, but most of us wouldn't tend to think that our laptop computer is aware of what it's doing. It could be behaving just like a robot, that when it's at a certain level of hunger and there's a certain amount of food around in the environment, the machinery of the brain triggers off food storing behavior. It would really require some very sophisticated experiments, in fact experiments that have not yet been devised, to find out if the animal is aware of the future consequences of what it's doing now. For me, the essence of consciousness is creating a virtual world in the mind to be able to anticipate or rehearse things that might happen in the future. And I see that as being rather a different aspect of behavior from remembering what's happened in the past.
Science doesn't insist that animals are unconscious robots, only that there's no good evidence that they're not. Ravens are clever birds, but a prominent American zoologist was sticking out his scientific neck a long way when he claimed that ravens can look into the future to see the solution to a problem they've never encountered before.
Well, the problem I gave them was to get food that was attached on their perch, dangling on a string. How do you get that food?
The experimental birds were hand-reared in an aviary and had never seen meat on the end of a string before. Heinrich is a world authority on ravens, and he's sure that nothing they do in the wild is remotely similar to this.
The way I saw it was, maybe it's a rare phenomenon. However, it's like genius. It exists, and if you show that it exists, that's all that's the important point. Anyways, I wrote it up and sent it in to a scientific journal, and it wasn't accepted. All I can say is that the comments that I got sounded like people were threatened, because they seemed to go out of their way to say nasty things that really didn't pertain to the paper even. And I just couldn't understand that. Well, right now they're a little bit, well actually they're probably quite a bit afraid of you, because they're only used to me, and any stranger they treat like a strange animal. I mean, they recognize individuals, and now they're hiding up there in their roost, where it's dark and they're protected, and that's their safe place, and that's where they always go. and that's where they'll stay as long as they see or hear you anywhere near here.
The original experiments were filmed by Heinrich in 1992, but he tried it again for us at his home in Vermont.
Okay, that's Goliath. He just got the meat. This is on the 17th of September, and this is the first time that they've ever done it.
Heinrich's critics were annoyed by his refusal to accept instinct or trial and error learning as an adequate explanation, and by his willingness to credit the ravens with insight in solving the problem.
By insight, I mean having a mental concept of a problem. In other words, here's a problem, and having a mental concept of a solution, and then doing the steps in the mind without doing it with the body first. In other words, I'm not saying they haven't done all the steps. They might have tried them all out, but they tried them out in the mind. They said they visualized that to pull on this string makes it come up, and to put it here and to put this on top means to hold it. In other words, they have visualized the consequences before actually doing them physically. That's what I would call insight.
Well, his interpretation is that the raven has what you might call the aha experience. It looks at the problem, works out a solution, and then goes straight to the final act. The alternative interpretation, what I would call the killjoy interpretation, is that what has been observed in a very much speeded up way is a sequence of trial and error learning. If you filmed it and slowed down the film and looked at it frame by frame, what you might see is the raven actually picking at the string, noting that the meat gets a little bit nearer when it tugs on the string, dropping the string, repeating that act, and gradually learning over a very rapid time period, maybe only a few seconds, to get the meat by pulling on the string. So there is a killjoy explanation that doesn't involve this leap of insight.
Animals can perform some very complex behaviors without being consciously aware. That's conceivable because we know that we humans can do some pretty complicated things without being aware of ourselves doing them. For example, assembling the words in a sentence. It's a really, when you try to get a machine to do it, when you try to get a computer to do it, to line up those words ready to go out in a comprehensible sentence, it's a very difficult thing to program a computer to do. We're doing it all the time, and we don't know how we do it. We don't have conscious access to that complicated sequencing process. So we know that complicated mental things can be done without conscious awareness.
Vampire bats share food, parrots talk, and chimps crack nuts with a favourite stone. It was once thought that using tools sets humans and other primates apart, because it implies such a sophisticated mind. But many scientists are sceptical and point to similar behaviour in creatures far less obviously impressive than chimpanzees.
I went to a favorite place on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where I had seen herring gulls dropping shells on a seawall, a long, thin surface of stone. And I'd seen gulls collecting shells and dropping them and breaking them open on that wall. It struck me that, at least superficially, in terms of this behavior, it was very similar to some of the things that the chimpanzees were doing. And so I wanted to see if there was evidence for the same sorts of cognitive activity in herring gulls that people were so readily able and comfortable to impute to the chimpanzee. When a gull collected a shell at low tide, the gull would pick up the shell, fly at a very low, fast height and go directly to the seawall, even though it couldn't see it. So that suggested to me that the gull had an image in its mind, a spatial map, if you will, of the surroundings. It also suggested some form of premeditation, some form of intention. And that same inference had been made about chimpanzees as they collect tools in the wild and then walk directly to either the termite mound or the place where they're going to break open nuts.
Everything you've told us, what does that tell us, if anything, about what it might be like to be inside that gull's head?
Ah, would that I could do that. I wish that's one of my great dreams as a scientist, and I think we're probably close to it in the next several decades. We're actually going to be able to assume the reality of being inside an animal's head. But right now we can't do that.
Science is by definition cautious and reluctant to speculate without hard evidence. Captain Ian Farker is unconstrained by the rules of the scientific game. As joint master of the Duke of Beaufort's foxhounds, he rides out 4 times a week in the hunting season. What can a man who spends his life so close to animals tell us about the minds of foxes and hounds?
I don't think they have a strong animosity for the fox. It's their breeding and their training is to hunt the smell and the line of that fox. They don't feel strongly about killing it, I don't believe. There isn't a tremendous bloodlust with them. Where I think it differs totally from the humans is that last night they didn't know that they were necessarily going hunting this morning. And so they didn't sit there all last night saying, I wonder what we're going to do tomorrow and how we're going to plan it. I always think probably the fox is much the same as the way in the hounds. The fact that he didn't sit there last night. And we didn't send him a warning card. We send the local farmers a warning card and they know we're coming. But obviously the fox doesn't get a warning card. So he didn't sit there last night thinking, Christ, I'm going to be hunted tomorrow morning, I better get a move on. Or I better not eat too much, so I won't be able to run very fast. He only twigs the fact that he's going to be hunted when he hears the first hound speak. If he's an old fox and he's been hunted before, he will probably hear my horn coming into the cover and will think, oh, they're back again, I haven't seen them for a year, I better shift. I don't think that a fox probably knows fear in the same way that we know fear. I don't think animals know fear in quite the same way as we know fear, because they don't have this pre-thought. They're merely reacting on the situation as they come across it.
It's split, he's on one box and the other one's on a row.
I don't think a fox works out the why. For instance, if you hunt a fox and he does something and he gets away, which he normally does, we're pretty inefficient, he will then do the same thing again because it worked the last time. And often it probably appears quite clever what he's done, but I think he's probably done it by mistake. And a lot of people will say, for instance, that a fox will run through sheep because he knows that a whole flock of sheep crossing his path obliterates the scent for the hounds. I don't think that the fox works out that if he runs through sheep, it's going to obliterate his smell. I think by chance he runs through sheep, it does obliterate his smell. Next time he thinks, well, it worked last time, I'll do it again. I don't think we will ever really understand what they're thinking. Personally, I don't think they have the same thought process as a human.
In the 17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes turned philosophy and science upside down. One of his most disturbing ideas was that animals can't feel pleasure or pain. Oddly enough, even now science can't tell us with precision which creatures feel pain and which might not.
I mean, it could be the case that consciousness is a peculiarity of humans. They got it when language evolved, and that pain is a side effect of consciousness. And so that animals that don't have our language and our consciousness don't have pain. I mean, you could argue that. Some people have.
If I ask you whether, say, a fox that's being torn by hounds or whatever
yes.
is in pain, what are you going to tell me? I mean, do you know or don't you?
Well, you don't know any more than you know anything about your fellow human beings, but you're using exactly the same kind of criteria that you would use for fellow human beings for these other animals. In other words, you're saying, are they exhibiting behavior that's like our behavior? Do they have underlying mechanisms which are like our underlying mechanisms? And the answer on both counts is yes, they do.
Britain has strict legal controls on how animals are used in scientific research. If their nervous system and behavior are similar to ours, they're protected under the Act to minimize suffering. The octopus was originally excluded.
We have a kind of checklist, and we just can go to another animal and see how many ticks we can put on this checklist. And when you do that, you find that pretty well every box is ticked for birds and mammals. It gets a bit more difficult for fish, but there's quite a lot of ticks there. And when you get to invertebrates, of course, there are many fewer ticks, and it raises peculiar problems, particularly associated with something like octopus.
Can you tell me about that? What's it like to be an octopus in pain, can we...
Jolly difficult. I mean, octopus has an enormous brain, but it's completely different in construction from a vertebrate brain. It develops in a quite different way. And there's no point of comparison, really, between an octopus brain and a vertebrate brain. So we have to really base our conclusions on behavior. And in terms of behavior, octopus is very, very smart and does a great deal that a rat could do, or a small monkey. I mean, they're very clever animals. And it was on that basis, and nothing to do with the nervous system, but just simply looking at the complexity of the behavior of octopus, that the Home Office committee that decides these things came to the conclusion that octopus, like the vertebrates, ought to be given the benefit of the doubt. Which is a very interesting conclusion. I mean, they did it purely on behavioral grounds. Really, at the end of the day, it comes down to a matter of ethics and taste.
The common octopus joined the ranks of protected animals in 1993, and now any research involving an octopus must be painless, even though there's no certainty that it can feel anything. When science can't be sure about something as vivid as pain, then how much harder it must be to find out about more subtle aspects of animal awareness.
If the consideration of the nature of animal minds wasn't a mess, philosophers wouldn't be interested in it. Suppose we watch a snake stalking a mouse, catching it, constricting it, killing it, and then eating it. And we wonder, well, what's it like for that snake to be doing this? And then we learn, as apparently we are learning from the people that have studied this, that in fact, there's no single unitary place in the snake where this whole adventure has taken place. When the snake is searching for the mouse, it's searching visually or using its thermal sensors. It's going for heat. When it struck the mouse, then it's got to find the mouse after it struck it, and it uses smell for that. But those are completely separate systems. And then, once it's located the mouse, it has to find the head, because it's going to swallow the mouse head first, and it uses touch for that. And even though one of its senses already has located the mouse, it has to use another sense at a different time to do the next thing. Now, it's as if there's 3 different snakes in there, one for hunting, one for locating, and one for finding the head. And what's it like to be the snake? Well, which snake? And it seems that these 3 snakes in one don't cooperate, they don't collaborate. They're not in the sort of organization that is the obvious key feature of our sort of consciousness. Our sort of consciousness is where we do compare the sights with the sounds and the feelings and the anticipations and the recollections. We have this wonderful capacity to bring everything that we've ever experienced to bear, if we only have the patience, all on this one issue. If other species just can't do that at all, then their consciousness is very, very different from ours, so different that to call it consciousness at all is perhaps to be misleading. And I think that there are many startling facts of that sort that we're going to learn.
Andy's coming in, guys.
My handsome little monkey.
Step on the row. Good, stay. Roll camera, please.
Some people think that, for instance, all mammals are pretty much people in fursuits or swimsuits. If they're dolphins, they're very much like us. They just don't have language.
Good, easy talk. Talk.
I think that the minds of other mammals are very, very different from our minds. And I think this will eventually be borne in. And it's going to be difficult for many people to accept, because it will mean that they will have over-endowed these charming creatures with mental lives for many years. They don't want to learn that. Do they have minds? I don't know. Just in case they do, we include them as having minds. But from the point of view of science, that's just the opposite attitude should prevail. Does it have a mind? Prove it.
One of the things that, of course, you can never get over is the lack of words. Words are so important for understanding, and a great many philosophers have said in the past, and I think this is also something that scientists think, that without words there is very little thought in the way that we understand thought, very little coherent thinking without words.
Okay, you've got to listen. How many? 2. 2 is right. Good boy. There's your 2. Good birdie. How many? Huh? Listen. How many? 3. Good boy. These birds are very intelligent. We don't know how they compare to other types of parrots, but in terms of the types of tests that we've given them, they have come up at the same level as the dolphins and the marine mammals. So in concepts of labeling and categorization, concepts of bigger and smaller, same and different. The only thing that they are not quite up to speed on is the numerical concepts, but we haven't given them all the tests necessary yet. So that's for the future. Hey, what matter? No, we did paper this morning. What matter is this? Wood. Wood. Good boy. That's right. Okay, you can have a nut. I got a nut. Just one. You'll get more nuts if you work. Okay. Hey, look, what's here? What toy? Rock. Rock, good boy. That's right. What we're showing here is that Alex's mind works in ways that are not terribly different from your mind or my mind. We show him the same types of objects, ask him the same types of questions that you would ask a young child. And he responds with roughly 80 to 90% accuracy on those types of tasks. And it gives us a feeling for what is going on in that little head of his. What matter?
Chalk.
Chalk, you're a good boy. Okay, you can have another nut. It suggests that there is a level of awareness that we haven't really accepted in these animals. But none of this is a proof of awareness. Certainly working with this bird, you have to realize that he's aware of his surroundings, he's aware of you, he's aware of me. We don't know if he's self-aware. We haven't got any tests that will prove that to my satisfaction. But he certainly has shown through these types of tests that there is a rather major little information processing center in that head. And that's really what I'm looking at. What is this, Alex? Key. Say better. Say better. Key. You're right. Key. Key. Do you want to try this, Kaya? Do you want to tell us? When these birds have labels for the objects, the labels are somewhat idiosyncratic in the sense that a key for Alex is something that he uses to scratch under his chin and around his face. It's not something to use to open a lock. Key! Yes! Good boy! What's here?
Beeper.
Beeper, yes, good boy. Beeper. Good birdie. You're such a good boy. One more task, okay? One more task. Okay, then we'll break for lunch. Okay, this is a confounded number task. And this is very complicated. What we have are several different objects of different colors, materials, and we have 2 sets of colors, 2 sets of materials. And if you give this task to a human and you ask the human how many blue block, the humans have to count. They can't do it by a guessing or a perceptual mechanism. By a perceptual mechanism, I mean if I go like that, you know it's 5 fingers. Where you don't count them, you just know it. So we're giving this test to Alex to see how well he corresponds to humans. Okay, Alex, look. Look at all this. Okay, I let him touch them so he sees that they're all different and he feels their difference. Okay, how many blue block? How many blue block?
You want to go back?
I know you want to go back. Just tell me how many blue block and then we'll cut for lunch. How many blue block?
2.
No, there's no 2 on the tray.
3.
3 is right. Good boy. All right, can you do this again?
There are certainly a few spectacular examples of behaviour which was thought to be very clever, to be indicative of some psychological complexity in animals, and then a very disappointing later demonstration that that was not the case. And perhaps the most famous case is Clever Hans. It seems that Hans was able to clop with his hoof to count, and he could do addition and subtraction by this method. He became famous throughout Europe as being a counting horse. And then one day, somebody called Funkst, it occurred to him what might be the alternative explanation. When Hans began to clop his hoof, when he was doing a sum, the people around would unconsciously and very slightly bend forwards. And then when Hans got to the number that they, the human observers, knew was the correct answer, then they would almost imperceptibly look up again. And what seems likely was that Hans was just, cleverly, cued in to this. All he did, as far as he was concerned, he just had to clop his hoof, starting when people looked down and stopping when people looked up. And examples like that, as it were, spectacular disappointments, I think, have made many scientists wary.
Can you just tell me, when we're watching this, how do I know this isn't one of these Clever Hans, famous Clever Hans cueing situations?
Well, part of the reason is the type of questions when I had the 2 objects and I asked 3 questions. He doesn't know what I'm asking unless he listens to the question. Hey, tell me, look, how many? How many?
2.
2 is right. Good boy. Okay, now tell me, what's different? What's different?
Color.
Color is right. Good boy. Now tell me, what color's smaller? Green is right. Good boy. Okay, he's not cued by those two objects because he has 3 different answers to the 3 different questions. We do, of course, when we do regular training and testing, particularly the testing, we take very strong precautions during testing. Students who never train a particular object are the ones who test him on that object. Even if I were cueing him to say green for something, if I was going good, they'd be green, gray, grape, grain, all sorts of things like that. We're very, very careful to avoid the clever Hans.
The clever Hans.
Well, the clever Hans itself is totally inappropriate parallel, because what Hans did was to stop tapping when he noticed the experimenter relax. So it was a sequential behavior, and the animal just stopped the sequential behavior. Alex has 100 different responses he could make to any question.
Wanna go back?
I know, and wanting to go back is a very strong one right now.
At a remote site in the Okavango Delta, 2 American professors of biology and psychology from the University of Pennsylvania have come to Botswana to study baboons. Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney are legendary in the field, mainly on the strength of some ingenious experiments they did in Kenya to decipher the alarm calls of vervet monkeys.
We originally started to work on the vervet monkeys because people had reported that they had alarm calls, that apparently different alarm calls for different types of predators.
We use human use of language to get an understanding of how people think, how they interact with one another. It's a sort of window onto their minds. Even though primates don't have language, we can nonetheless use the communication that they do have as a window onto their minds.
When they see a leopard, they give a loud alarm call. And immediately, all the members of the group run up into a tree. They're safe from leopards in trees because leopards can't go out on the small branches that the monkeys can. When they see an eagle, they give a different sounding alarm call, and everyone looks up in the air or they run into bushes. They don't run up into trees, and that's interesting because eagles can take them from trees, sort of zipping through the branches and plucking a monkey off. And the way we investigated is to tape record vocalizations, the calls that monkeys gave when they were actually encountering leopards or martial eagles or snakes. Then we played the alarm call from the speaker and watched to see what the monkeys did. We did this when there were no predators around, so that at this point we're presenting the monkeys with the call and no predator that they can see, to see if the call alone is sufficient to evoke the different responses. When we played them a snake alarm call, they immediately stood on their hind legs and looked in the grass around them. And when we played them a leopard alarm call, all the monkeys ran up into the tree.
Do you believe that primates use language?
I think that many of the calls these animals give function as if they were words, in the sense that they are capable of providing information to listeners. I think there are a number of crucial differences. The first is that no one has yet found any evidence for syntax or grammar, that is, the combining of words into sentences, in any non-human species. And the other crucial difference, I think, is that these animals are not really, as I said before, imputing mental states to others. They're not using their calls in order to inform or in order to deceive. They're not doing it consciously. The calls may end up functioning to inform. If I'm a baboon or a vervet monkey and I give an eagle alarm call, my audience can recognize that there's an eagle nearby. But it's unlikely that I'm giving that call because I recognize that my audience is ignorant and I'm knowledgeable and I want to help them to recognize there's an eagle.
That's what you've been able to find out?
Well, it's a tricky issue, but that's what our evidence points in that direction.
Seyfarth and Cheney are now trying to decode baboon grunts, using the same recording and playback techniques they pioneered in Kenya. It's a long-term project, but they've already got some ideas about what the grunts might mean.
They could be using these grunts to grease the social wheels, much in the way we use conversation, not to achieve some dramatic change in behavior, but just to affect the way things happen. So in that sense, they have a language-like function. When they communicate with one another, are they taking the sounds that they hear and treating them as representations of the thoughts that lie behind them, or are they just taking them as sounds that mean it's cool or I'm angry? That's the question right now.
And what's the answer?
The answer with baboons is they're probably not doing that. They're probably not attributing mental states to the callers when the callers communicate. They may be showing us just how complex a society you can have without a theory of mind. There is a lot of infanticide in this population, that when a male comes in and takes over the group, he often goes around and tries to kill the infants. On the other hand, they also want to mate with females and be friends with them, so they're faced with a problem. How do they do this and still maintain close ties? And one of the ways that they seem to do it is by using vocalizations to appease females, to let them know my intentions are benign. And that's a sort of nervous grunt that they use.
Seyfarth and Cheney have been studying primates in the wild for 20 years now. They must know more than anyone else about what animals are thinking.
What do each of you in turn sort of now think about what it's like to be, say, a baboon? Or what can be said about what it's like to be a baboon, if anything?
Sometimes you think every 10 or 15 minutes the world begins anew. As Dorothy says, you know, you begin to wonder when you see the same females greeting one another 20 times a day. In some respects, they do have this long history of social interaction and a long history of social relationships, and that does make a difference. But in other respects, things start new all the time.
It seems as if they don't sit down and really say, hey, this is what I know. They're behaving without thinking, in a sense. Although, obviously, without thinking actively upon what they're doing. And I think you could say they don't know what they know.
The fact is, it's extremely difficult to know what goes on in human beings' mind, not only animals' minds. Even human beings are very isolated and solitary people. I mean, I don't know what you really think. We're isolated. We're alone when we're born. We're alone when we die. And in life, we're very solitary too, because we really don't know what's going on in other people's minds. And I think that applies even more to bats and cats and dogs and butterflies. And butterflies can taste with their feet. It often strikes me as a very odd idea if we were walking about tasting through our boots. But I mean, all these things, you know, you can think about, but you're left really wondering. But that doesn't alter my feelings about a better relationship that's possible with animals, even though we're so ignorant about really basic what they're thinking.